Hello guys, welcome to episode 8 of Santa Capricia. So what are we doing today? Well, I've decided to move away from the area that I was working on the past few episodes now. Wanted to do something a bit different, and I really wanted to get into the kind of industrial area, the port facilities and all around there. And the first thing that really I need to do is get down the railway or the rail network, because the rail network is going to pretty much define where the different parts of the port will be. And therefore it seemed logical that I start really with the rail yard, the actual freight terminal and all the tracks for all the wagons and everything. And the rail yard is also one of the largest kind of areas of the port area. So yeah, it makes sense that I get that down. But before we get into that, this episode is going to be split because the rail yard is too big for me to do one episode on. As it was, I've actually got about, I don't know how many hours of footage, which I've had to edit down considerably because, well, there was just too much of it. And pretty much most of it isn't even the rail yard itself. It's sorting out the rail network immediately adjacent to the yard. Because, for example, what I'm doing here is laying down the main through line for the commuter service from the city, and also juggling all the different rail networks and connections that will eventually join up to the rail yard and also go off to the separate parts of the harbour and the port region. So for example, there's going to be rail networks going to the container port. There'll be a rail network going to the sort of car import area, so all the cars are unloaded. There'll be a rail network going to the steel mill, so I want to have a steel mill involved here as well as the oil refinery and general just freight terminal running through, or freight line running through this whole region. So there's a lot of rail networks that need to be put down before I can actually get to grips with the rail yard itself. And I kind of got a little bit sidetracked, as you can see, with all these little details and things. But the thing with the city is I don't like to leave areas unfinished, and I'd rather finish them off as I go and progress to the next stage of the city, knowing that I've done everything that I was working on, rather than leaving it halfway through. And I think probably people, maybe, other people doing cities have a similar sort of, philosophy, I suppose, in terms of how they build their cities. Maybe you like to finish off, or you're happy to go back and rework areas. I'm not. I don't like that. Once I've done it, I don't particularly want to go back and have to change it or add more details. I'd rather then focus and keep it fresh as well, and just focus on a new area. So what I'm doing is I'm filling up this area that I've got next to the rail line, getting this done, or certainly getting it into some kind of semi-finished state, which means that I can then focus on the rail yard itself. And these little kind of bridges and things, I'm just putting some detailing underneath of those, because this line here, the rail line here, is one of the main commuter lines from downtown. It will be going north towards where eventually the airport will be. So this is quite an important rail network route. It also feeds into the rail yard, although is not directly kind of related to it, because the freight won't be using this line. This will be purely sort of commuter trains, but it still connects to it. So I thought if I get this set up first of all, then I can focus on doing the rail yard. Now the rail yard itself is pretty big. They do tend to be pretty large areas, and I've been looking at a few online, just on Google Maps and things, and trying to work out really how these rail yards work, or how they appear to work, or visually look like they work. Because I don't think I'm going to be too fussed that it doesn't really function properly. As long as it looks like it does, that's the most important thing for me. It's all about giving the illusion that this is a real living city. Now, there are some big rail yards in the States. LA and San Diego got these, and I've kind of looked at some of those, but also at one of the biggest, I think it is the biggest rail yard in the world, which is one called Bailey's or Bailey Yard, and that's in a town called North Platte in Nebraska. I think that's officially the largest rail yard in the world, and it looks like a huge, I mean, it covers a huge area, but it's kind of more of a rural rail yard. But I just quite like the way some of the tracks and everything work there. It is quite confusing, the sort of different spurs and connections that it seems to use. And the other thing is, I noticed the tracks are quite close together, so when I lay down the tracks for the rail yard at the sort of towards the end of the video, those need to be moved around. I realise now that I need to actually make them probably a lot closer, certainly to one another, because when you look at, especially if you're looking at that one online, Bailey Yard, the trucks or the wagons are pretty close to one another. Yeah, not, you know, they're not. There's not a huge gap between, and I guess it makes sense just to get as many kind of wagons in as you can into that area. So that's something I need to edit, but you know, it's all kind of like the learning curve, really. And this is me getting distracted here, so I'm putting a custom sign in Postilion, which is the area that the harbour kind of is, sort of, but not really, because this Postilion itself is further north from here. I'm kind of losing my my marbles a little here. I'm getting a bit waylaid, but it doesn't matter, you know, it's all these details kind of add to it. And I thought what I wanted to do was put this road down next to or between the freeway there and where the rail yard will be, which is on the other side of those tracks. And again, it's because there's an empty space, and I don't like having empty space in between something I'm building or working on. So I ended up filling this area with little kind of warehouses and areas of just sort of areas of waste ground, really, just wild areas that have been left, you know, as you get in cities, sort of just derelict, abandoned areas, which I quite like those sort of places, really. It's quite, with city skylines you can create that very easy, especially if you're using the decals and the sort of grass and the plants and stuff, as well as all the sort of trash rubbish props and things. You can add those in, and it really does, you know, it gets you good sort of details, which I really like to use for these particularly these big American sort of builds or American style cities. And these little sort of warehouses and things have just been planted in, and you know, all these little details are really function purely as a backdrop, really, just almost like window dressing for the rail yard itself, which is, as I say, it's big. I mean, it's a big area, and one of the things that I kind of struggled with was, how do I detail something that size? Because when you're doing stuff like this, it's very easy, you know, it's a fairly small area, you can put little props and things in, and it doesn't mess your brain up too much. You can focus quite easily on those sort of smaller regions. But when you've got a big plot like a rail yard, the level of detail is going to be less, because you just cannot add all this stuff into something that big. I mean, yes, you can copy and paste it, but it just gets ridiculous. So what I want to do is almost break it up to make it look, or just to avoid it just looking like a big area that's just one colour or one sort of like one ground texture. And I ended up, for the rail yard, using a lot of decals just to sort of try and cover that ground and to sort of break it up a bit. And you'll see a bit coming up soon, I think, me starting to add those, certainly when the tracks go on, to add those decals in to try and get rid of that sort of big sort of area, because a lot of the rail yards are kind of bare earth or a mixture of concrete and so forth, but I didn't want to just lay down a big mass of concrete, because that, you know, that, like the ground texture, it just looks too much if it's just left unfinished. So it needed some kind of detail, but not too much. And I think decals are the way to go, because they do give you the detail without, you know, going overboard. So if you get a big enough decal, you can cover quite a big area, which is what I ended up doing, and then mixing a few to give me some kind of almost like a random kind of randomization to the ground, rather than it just looking like a big bland plain. And I think once I get other props in, like the sort of signalling equipment and the sort of power lines and the wagons themselves, that also will help to break up the sort of big ground surface texture. Because it's just a big flat area basically, and it still needs to look like it's a real sort of a real place. That makes no sense, but I think you'll see in a minute how I start to deal with that. And it looks a bit strange just putting loads of decals down, but I think the end result will kind of, I hope will kind of work. And once I get the sort of plants or sort of weeds and scrub and all that in, which will probably be in the next episode, then I think it'll work okay. So all these little areas here, you can see I'm getting carried away with this, but I think it's important to show, because it shows what you end up doing when you start planning something out. So I knew I was going to do the rail yard. What I didn't know was that I'd have to start laying down the main sort of through rail network, and then also all the road connections and thus all the buildings as well. So you end up having to do quite a lot before you can actually get to the part you actually wanted to build in the first place, which was the rail yard itself. And also I got involved with then detailing this bridge up, because I wanted to make sure that looked good. So yeah, I just struggle because I get so sidetracked. I end up building stuff that I never planned to do, but that's just the way the game is. And before you know it, you spent 4 hours and you haven't actually done anything you were supposed to have done. And I was hoping that this episode, maybe this episode would be the rail yard episode, but actually it's going to be episode 1 of the rail yard, and I think I'll probably be finished in the second episode. But as of yet, I haven't made any headway. What you see at the end of this video in the cinematics is what it is at the moment. I haven't done anything else to it, but I think probably one more episode and I should be complete for the rail yard. But as I say, it is a big area, which is a little bit daunting. So we'll have to see. So PO, using these PO assets just to sort of make this bridge embankment section, which I'm doing a lot now. I'm kind of using this as just a staple kind of tool for the game, and it's just like using Move It now. PO, it's become kind of second nature just to convert these things into PO and then start editing them and moving them about and so forth. Fantastic mod, and I really think that the city is going to be just a different beast now that I've got PO. Because when I started this a couple of months back, I mean, Santa Capricia is what, two months old, I guess now, probably about 2 months. This mod I didn't know about. I mean, mod has been out for a little while, I think, but I didn't know anything about it. And when I downloaded it, I still wasn't quite sure what I'd got. And it was really only just seeing the tutorials and made me realise just what the level of sort of creativity is really with the mod, what you can achieve. And I really do recommend anyone out there that's thinking about using PO mod, go ahead and do it, because it does give you a lot more flexibility and a lot more sort of power and control on your city. And here finally, as you can see, what I'm doing here is laying down the area for where the rail yard is. And just the first thing is to work out the main through rail network, the main through tracks that will go through the rail yard, because the way the rail yards seem to work is you have all these different spurs coming off them, and those spurs then have the area where the wagons can be stored, and then usually you have the spurs joining back onto the main rail track at the other end. So they generally seem to be like that, rather than kind of spurs with a dead end at the end. Although some of them do have dead ends, and I'm going to be building a lot of kind of train storage depots and things like that on those. But these ones will be kind of double-ended, I suppose. So they've got a spur at either end, rejoining the main rail track. And I spent ages trying to, get these curves and things working. And generally it does work, but as I mentioned before, what I realised is I have to move the tracks much closer together, because they do generally seem to be quite close, the tracks for these rail yards, just to maximise the amount of space for them. The rail network, I haven't used this that much, I guess. Generally the cities I've done in the past, I haven't actually got to the stage where I've managed to put railways down. So I'm not that comfortable with working with them, although, again, it's a little bit of a learning curve and how these sort of work and so forth. But I haven't really done that many railways in the past. Well, to be honest, I haven't done any in the past on previous cities, because, as I say, I just haven't got to that stage. But Santa Capricia is very different, and because I've started the city in this industrial area, I had to really get to grips with where the railway is going to be from word go, really. And so, yeah, it's an integral kind of part of the city, really, the railway or the rail network here. So this is me putting these decals down, just trying to get the ground, or break up the ground, the monotony of the ground by introducing these decals. And it's I think it's okay. At the moment it looks a bit rubbish because it's sort of just like a copy and paste job. But once I start adding some weeds and stuff, I think that will also help to break it up. And this is a custom build, a custom train shed or a train depot or whatever you want to call it. Just use one of those sort of garage doors that I downloaded, and again just change the colour to make it look a little bit more like a kind of train shed. And then I was getting into the detail. I thought about having a kind of it's a rolling shutter, so there'd be some kind of like canopy or something that the shutter kind of rolls up into, which is why I'm then doing this with one of these car park ticket machine things, and I'm editing that, making it into like a sort of shutter canopy, if that's what you can call it. But yeah, this shows what you can do with PO. This is really you can make your own assets, you make your own props, because I didn't really have anything out there that I could use as a kind of like a rolling shutter canopy. But there you go. And I quite like the yellow colour. It seemed to work quite well with the railway. Yeah. So now just putting down some sort of switching gear for the junctions, and yeah, starting to detail up the rail yard, and again another custom build. So we're getting towards the end of the episode now. I've got some cinematics which are worth hanging around for, because they kind of show what I've been working on the last, there's probably, 10 hours worth of work here. So it's worth staying around and seeing those, because it'll give you a much better sense of where all this stuff is. Hopefully, yeah, you'll see the amount of work that I've been spending on this region, and the amount of work I've still got to do, because, as I say, it's such a massive build, this rail yard. But it's a key kind of infrastructure area, so I'm not too worried. But anyway, I shall leave you with the cinematics. Please do hit the like button, and I'll see you for episode 9. Bye, guys.